The lights went out, and for a heartbeat, the arena felt suspended in time. Then, one sharp note cut through the dark. A single, electrifying chord that tore open decades of silence. The crowd exploded, voices colliding in a roar that shook the rafters. 3 silhouettes stood in the glow of white spotlights: Geddy Lee, Alex Lifeson, and Neil Peart, Rush. Legends who had shaped generations with riffs that defied gravity and lyrics that spoke to the restless soul of an era. But tonight wasn't just another reunion, it was resurrection. For years, the music world had moved on, machines perfecting imperfection, chart toppers chasing algorithms instead of meaning. Auto-tune ruled, authenticity faded, and somewhere along the way, the sound of real instruments had become a rebellion. Yet here they were, 3 men who had once written symphonies out of noise and poetry out of chaos, returning to a stage that had almost forgotten what truth sounded like. The cameras panned over faces in the crowd, some gray with time, some too young to remember Rush's reign, all united by one thing: awe. When Geddy's fingers found the bass strings, when Alex's guitar screamed its first solo, the air felt alive again. It wasn't just music, it was a declaration. This was defiance against the disposable. This was craftsmanship against convenience. This was proof that you could age, lose, fall silent, and still come back louder than ever. The band's sound rolled across the crowd like thunder, each note a reminder of why they mattered, why they had to come back. But behind the flashing lights and the triumphant noise, there was a story few knew. A story of loss, of grief so heavy it silenced even the loudest hearts. The battles they fought weren't just with time or fame, they were with life itself. And as the final note of the opening song rang out, echoing like a heartbeat across the arena, no one in the crowd could have guessed what it had taken for them to stand on that stage again. For years, Rush had been more than a band, they were a blueprint for what music could be when intellect met emotion, when precision met soul. But in 2020, that sound went quiet forever. The world watched as Neil Peart, the heartbeat behind the drums, the poet behind the words, was taken by an illness he kept fiercely private. When the news broke, fans didn't just mourn a musician, they mourned an era. Because with Neil's passing, something deeper died too, the hope that Rush would ever play again. The silence that followed wasn't ordinary silence. It was the kind that lingered like unfinished lyrics, the kind that echoed in stadiums that once trembled under their sound. Interviews stopped. Geddy Lee retreated from the stage, Alex Lifeson stopped touring altogether, and the band's story, once written in thunder and light, seemed to close on a quiet, painful note. For fans who grew up decoding their lyrics, building their lives around Rush's rhythm and resilience, it felt like losing an old friend who had always understood them. But time has a way of refusing to stay still. Across continents, from Toronto basements to Tokyo record shops, fans began whispering the same question: what if? What if they came back, not as replacements, not as nostalgia, but as a living testament to what they built? Forums lit up. Tribute shows multiplied. Artists from Metallica to Foo Fighters spoke publicly about how Rush wasn't just music, it was architecture, science, and heart stitched into one sound. Then came the first rumor, a possible return. A small interview, a hint dropped by Geddy, a quiet smile when asked about playing again. The world didn't need confirmation, they needed hope. Because in an industry that now measured success in streams and seconds, Rush's comeback promised something real. It wasn't just about hearing Tom Sawyer live again. It was about remembering what it meant to feel music, to stand in a crowd and be moved by something unfiltered, something human. And so, when the official announcement came, Rush returning to the road, it hit like a cultural earthquake. For millions, this wasn't a tour. It was a resurrection. A moment when artistry stood defiant against automation, when 3 men reminded the world that legacy doesn't fade, it waits. In the first week, tickets vanished in minutes. Fans flew across oceans, parents passed down vinyls to their children, and social media flooded with old posters, tattoos, memories. It wasn't just excitement, it was devotion, reignited. But beneath the celebration, beneath the noise, there lingered a question none of them could shake. How do you return to the stage when one of your own is gone? How do you rebuild a sound when the heartbeat is missing? Because behind every chord of triumph lies the shadow of loss. And to understand this moment, to truly grasp the weight of their return, we have to go back, to when everything almost fell apart. Time had always been Rush's quietest rival. Not an enemy made of flesh and ego, but one built from silence and erosion. The kind that wears down even the sharpest edges, softens the defiant, and whispers, "Your era is over." For years, that whisper grew louder. Rock radio faded into nostalgia circuits. Record stores became streaming algorithms. Songs were no longer lived with, they were scrolled past. The world that once worshipped long solos and layered lyrics now lived on 15-second loops, engineered for instant dopamine hits. The machine had learned to package emotion, and in the process, had forgotten what it meant to feel it. For Rush, who built their empire on complexity and craft, this new world felt foreign. Their albums had been journeys, not products, each one a map of human struggle wrapped in sound. But now, audiences were trained to skip. Critics, once poetic, now wrote with algorithms in mind. Too long, too technical, too old. The band's meticulousness, the very trait that made them legendary, had become their greatest liability in a culture that worshipped immediacy. The industry had changed its language. Where once mastery was the metric, now virality was the prize. Labels no longer hunted for musicians, they hunted for moments. Even the veterans who once filled stadiums were told to adapt or disappear. To many, Rush had already done the latter. Their absence became proof that the world had moved on. Time, too, was unkind. Age brought not just wisdom but doubt. Geddy Lee's hands, once lightning over the bass strings, now carried the stiffness of years. Alex Lifeson's joints bore the memory of every chord ever played. And behind them, the ghost of Neil Peart, his loss not just emotional but artistic. His precision had been the foundation of their sound. Without him, the balance felt incomplete, the machine missing its core gear. Meanwhile, critics circled like vultures, eager to crown the next saviors of rock. They wrote obituaries disguised as retrospectives. Rush's final act was perfect. Let it end there. But behind the cynicism was something darker, a collective fear of irrelevance. Because if even Rush, the perfectionists of their age, could be swallowed by the algorithmic tide, what hope was there for anyone who still believed in art for art's sake? And yet, the machine didn't just erase, it mocked. Streaming platforms built playlists of classic rock legends, lumping masterpieces beside jingles. Comment sections filled with kids asking, who even listens to this anymore? For a band that once challenged listeners to think, to feel, it was like watching a cathedral turned into a souvenir shop. Still, there was something the machine couldn't quantify: devotion. The fans who refused to move on, who still gathered online to decode lyrics and debate drum fills, were like sparks in the dark. They didn't want replacements or remixes, they wanted truth. And that longing began to grow, quiet but persistent, until it formed something bigger, a resistance. Rush's legacy was too heavy, too intricate, too human to be forgotten. It haunted playlists, inspired documentaries, and lived on in musicians who refused to take shortcuts. Every time a young artist picked up a guitar to learn, not just to perform, Rush's spirit pulsed again. Still, for Geddy and Alex, the question remained: could they return without him? Could they defy time, grief, and a system that no longer cared for what they stood for? To come back meant risking not just failure, but disillusionment, to be measured against their own myth. But history has a way of rewarding those who dare the impossible. And just when the world thought Rush was gone for good, everything changed. Before Rush became a monument to musical ambition, they were just three men chasing a sound that didn't exist yet. Geddy Lee, Alex Lifeson, and Neil Peart. Three names that would one day echo in the halls of rock history, were, at their core, a story of brotherhood built through noise, silence, and everything in between. For Geddy Lee, music was never just melody. It was identity. The son of Holocaust survivors, he grew up in a home shadowed by trauma but filled with quiet resilience. Every note he sang, every bass line he sculpted, felt like a rebellion against silence, a declaration that life, no matter how scarred, deserved to be heard. His mother's voice urging him to chase what made him feel alive still echoed in his mind even decades later, through the roar of arenas and the solitude of recording studios. Alex Lifeson, the heart of Rush's sound, was the dreamer grounded in craft. The kid who built guitars out of scraps and learned chords from his father's old radio. He was never the loudest, never the flashiest, but every time his fingers touched the strings, he spoke in a language the world didn't yet understand. Alex brought melody where chaos reigned, warmth where cold precision might have taken over. And through all the fame and fatigue, he remained the quiet engine, humble, kind, the balance between Geddy's fire and Neil's storms. Then there was Neil Peart, the thinker, the seeker, the poet who drummed philosophy into rhythm. While others wrote lyrics about love and rebellion, Neil wrote about free will, dystopia, and the soul's quiet war with destiny. His words turned Rush's music into literature, his drumming made time itself feel human. Yet behind the perfection was a man haunted by imperfection. His drive to be flawless wasn't ego, it was fear. Fear of not living up to the brilliance others saw in him. Fear of failing the art he worshipped. The trio wasn't just a band. They were a brotherhood forged through the kind of pain most can't imagine, creative exhaustion, personal tragedy, and, eventually, silence. After Neil Peart's unimaginable losses, first his daughter in a car accident, then his wife to cancer, the man who once filled arenas with thunder disappeared into stillness. He took to the road, not to tour, but to escape, riding his motorcycle across continents, trying to outrun grief. Geddy and Alex, bound by love and respect, never pushed. They knew Rush wasn't Rush without Neil. And so, for years, they waited. Quietly. Patiently. When Neil finally returned, it wasn't triumph, it was survival. The band played like men who'd seen too much, who knew the fragility of everything they'd built. Every performance after that felt like a goodbye that refused to end. And when Neil retired, and later, when he passed in 2020, it wasn't just a drummer the world lost. It was Rush's heartbeat. For Geddy and Alex, the silence that followed was unbearable. They were no longer the hungry kids of Toronto, nor the virtuosos worshipped by millions. They were two aging musicians staring into the void left by their brother. And by a world that had moved on from the kind of mastery they spent their lives perfecting. Fans mourned Neil. But for Geddy and Alex it was something deeper, the collapse of a shared soul. The thought of making music again felt like betrayal. How can you play without him? People asked. And truthfully, they couldn't. For a while, even the thought of it felt wrong. But silence can be louder than any note. And in that quiet, something began to shift. Geddy started writing again, not songs, but memories. He poured his life into a memoir, reflecting on the decades of laughter, exhaustion, and creation. In revisiting those memories, he began to feel Neil's presence not as loss, but as legacy. Alex, too, found himself drawn back to the guitar, not to perform, but to remember what it felt like to feel. Slowly, the grief that once chained them began to hum, a faint, familiar rhythm returning from the dark. These weren't young men chasing fame anymore. They were survivors, artists wrestling with mortality, relevance, and what it means to leave something behind. Rush had always been about more than music. They represented the idea that intelligence, craftsmanship, and honesty could coexist in rock, that you could be both philosopher and performer. But now, that philosophy faced its greatest test. Could legacy live on without the people who built it? Could art still matter in a world obsessed with the temporary? The answer, as it always had been, would come not in words, but in sound. And so, one evening in a quiet Toronto studio, two old friends sat across from each other. The air was thick with unspoken memories. On the table lay a single sheet of lyrics Neil had written years ago, unfinished. Geddy looked at Alex, fingers twitching with nervous energy. Alex smiled faintly, as if to say, maybe it's time. The silence broke. A bass string hummed. A chord followed. And for the first time in years, Rush wasn't gone. It was reborn. Cliffhanger, but one conversation in a quiet Toronto studio would change everything. The idea of Rush without Neil Peart wasn't just unthinkable, it was sacrilege. For decades, Neil had been the soul behind the drum kit, the quiet philosopher who gave Rush its depth and dignity. To even consider returning without him felt wrong. Like painting over a masterpiece, or rewriting the ending of a sacred book. And yet, the silence was deafening. After years of mourning, whispers began to stir online, subtle at first, then thunderous. Geddy and Alex are meeting again. Could Rush return? Some fans clung to hope, others recoiled in disbelief. Comment sections turned into battlegrounds. It wouldn't be Rush without Neil, versus Neil would have wanted the music to live on. It wasn't just a fan debate, it was an identity crisis. What does legacy mean when one part of it is gone? Can something still be whole when it's missing its heart? Inside that quiet Toronto studio, the questions burned even hotter. Geddy and Alex didn't talk about it much. They didn't have to. Every note, every pause, was a question. Would continuing dishonor Neil's memory, or keep it alive? Was this healing, or hubris? The world outside demanded answers. Music journalists began weighing in, some with reverence, others with cynicism. Rush was built on the Trinity, remove one, and it collapses. Art evolves. If there's anyone who can redefine what Rush means, it's Geddy and Alex. The arguments spilled into podcasts, Reddit threads, and late-night interviews. For some, the idea of Rush continuing was romantic, two lifelong friends honoring their fallen brother through the only language they knew, music. But for others, it felt like betrayal, an attempt to resurrect something that should rest in peace. Meanwhile, Geddy found himself haunted by his own words from years ago, Rush isn't a brand. It's a bond. He replayed that line again and again in his head. The bond wasn't broken, but it had changed. Neil wasn't gone from their hearts, he was woven into them. Every rhythm, every lyric, every silence carried his fingerprints. Still, doubt lingered like smoke. One night, after a small charity performance with Alex, Geddy sat backstage long after everyone had left. The cheers had faded, replaced by the hum of distant traffic. On the table beside him lay an old set list, the songs they used to play, the ones that defined generations. He ran his fingers over Neil's handwriting on the corner, "Play with heart." That was the moment it clicked. Maybe it wasn't about replacing Neil. Maybe it was about remembering him the only way they knew how, through sound, through performance, through passion. But the road ahead wasn't simple. Managers, producers, and old friends weighed in. Some urged them forward, it's what the fans need. Others cautioned restraint, don't risk the sanctity of what you built. Even among the fans, lines were drawn like borders in the sand. The purists called it heresy. Rush died with Neil, they said. Anything else is an imitation. They clung to the idea that finality was sacred, that perfection should remain untouched. The believers, however, saw it differently. Rush was never about endings, they argued. It was about pushing limits, defying time, and finding new meaning in change. For them, Geddy and Alex's return wouldn't erase Neil, it would extend him. And in the middle of it all, the two men who had lived the story stayed silent. Weeks turned into months. Rumors intensified. Anonymous leaks hinted at studio sessions, demo tracks, unfinished lyrics. Every whisper fueled the fire. The world was divided, but united in one thing: anticipation. Then came the breaking point. An interviewer asked Geddy, point blank, "Will Rush ever play again?" He paused for a long time, the kind of silence that holds history inside it. Then, with a half-smile that said everything and nothing, he replied, "Maybe the story isn't over yet." The internet exploded. Fans dissected every syllable, critics penned essays overnight. Hope flared again, fragile, defiant, unstoppable. Geddy and Alex had always believed in evolution. Rush was never meant to be static. They'd changed genres, instruments, even philosophies. Why should this be any different? Maybe this wasn't a return to the past. Maybe it was an acceptance of the present. As debates raged, one question began to overshadow them all: not will they, but how? And just when speculation reached its peak, when the noise became deafening and the world leaned in for an answer. Until one night, a message from Geddy Lee silenced every doubt. The room was silent, that heavy, expectant kind of silence that feels alive. Inside a dimly lit Toronto rehearsal studio, Geddy Lee stood in front of his old bass, the same battered Fender that had seen arenas, decades, and heartbreak. His fingers hovered above the strings, trembling slightly. Across from him, Alex Lifeson adjusted his guitar strap, the low hum of his amplifier cutting through the quiet. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The air was thick with ghosts. Neil's drum kit stood off to the side, polished, untouched. They hadn't moved it. Couldn't move it. It was both an altar and a reminder. Then, without a word, Geddy plucked the first note. A low, resonant growl filled the room, familiar yet raw. Alex joined in, slow at first, his chord circling Geddy's rhythm like a heartbeat rediscovering its pace. It wasn't perfect. It didn't need to be. By the second minute, the hesitation melted. The sound grew, alive, defiant, pure. It was Rush again, not as they once were, but as they were meant to be now. The ghosts didn't leave, they harmonized. And when they finished, there was no applause. Just two men standing still, breathing hard, eyes wet. Geddy whispered, almost to himself, "He's still here." That was the moment they knew. 2 months later, rumors of an intimate live performance began circulating online. No confirmation. No poster. Just a cryptic post on Geddy's social feed. Tomorrow. Toronto. One night only. No one believed it at first. Then, as photos leaked of trucks unloading equipment outside Massey Hall, disbelief turned to chaos. Fans camped outside overnight, desperate to be part of what everyone hoped, and feared, was true. When the doors finally opened, the hall buzzed like a living organism. People hugged strangers. Grown men wept. The air smelled of sweat, anticipation, and history about to repeat itself. Cameras from every major outlet lined the aisles. Then the lights dimmed. The stage remained dark for a full 30 seconds, long enough for the crowd to start whispering, hearts pounding. Then, a single spotlight illuminated the bass mic. Geddy Lee walked out. No grand entrance. No pyrotechnics. Just him, older, grayer, but unshakably present. The cheers hit him like a tidal wave. He smiled, swallowed hard, and said softly, "This isn't a comeback." The crowd hushed, as if collectively holding its breath. "This is a continuation." Then came the first riff, the opening notes of "Spirit of Radio." It was seismic. The sound hit like memory itself, washing over the room. Every chord carried decades of meaning. Every lyric echoed through time. Alex joined him at center stage, grinning wide, lost in the music. Behind them, the video screen lit up, not with flashy visuals, but with footage of peart drumming. His face, his energy, his fire. The crowd gasped. And then, silence again. From the darkness, a single spotlight fell on an empty drum kit. Not Nilles, but a new one, smaller, cleaner, waiting. And then, a young drummer stepped forward. Nervous. Respectful. He didn't speak. He just sat down, closed his eyes, and played. The crowd didn't resist. They roared, not in betrayal, but in acceptance. The sound was perfect. Not imitation, but evolution. Nilles' spirit pulsed through every fill, every crash. The young drummer played with reverence, not ego. It was as if 3 generations of Rush fans, past, present, and future, merged in that one sound. For the next hour, the band tore through songs that felt both ancient and new: Tom Sawyer, Limelight, Closer to the Heart. Every lyric now meant something deeper. Living on a lighted stage approaches the unreal wasn't just about fame anymore, it was about survival, memory, and resilience. When they reached the bridge of Time Stands Still, the crowd sang louder than the band. Geddy stepped back from the mic, listening. Tears streamed down his face. For a moment, he wasn't performing, he was witnessing. The people had become the chorus, carrying the music forward. Between songs, Geddy spoke softly into the mic. People ask why we came back. The truth is, we never left. Music doesn't die. It waits. It listens. It finds its way back when the world needs it again. That line hit like lightning. It wasn't just about Rush, it was about everyone who'd ever lost something, then found the courage to start again. The final song of the night was one no one expected, a stripped-down, acoustic version of The Garden. Just Geddy and Alex. The lyrics, "The measure of a life is a measure of love and respect," felt like a benediction. By the time they finished, the audience was standing in silence. Not cheering. Just feeling. Then came the mic drop moment, literal and symbolic. Geddy looked at Alex, then at the crowd, and said, "For Neil." He placed the microphone on the stage floor and walked off into the dark. The applause that followed wasn't noise, it was thunder made of gratitude. The kind that shakes walls and hearts alike. That night, social media imploded. Clips flooded every platform within minutes. #RushReturns trended globally. News outlets broke the story simultaneously. Legendary band Rush stuns the world with surprise reunion show. Fans from Tokyo to Buenos Aires posted tearful reactions. Celebrities tweeted their disbelief. Musicians called it the most emotional performance in modern rock history. In the days that followed, something extraordinary happened. The numbers didn't just climb, they exploded. Millions watched, rewatched, shared, and cried. It wasn't just nostalgia, it was validation. In an age of short attention spans, 3 men had reminded the world that mastery still mattered. Music journalists who had once dismissed them now wrote essays filled with awe. Rush didn't return to the stage, one headline read. They resurrected the idea of authenticity. For Geddy and Alex, the afterglow was surreal. In private, they sat together in the quiet, surrounded by flowers, letters, and messages from around the world. Geddy smiled at his old friend and said, "Guess we didn't need to come back after all. We just needed to remind them we were still here." Alex chuckled. "We always were." Outside, in the city streets, murals of peart began to appear overnight. Strangers left drumsticks at his old haunts. Radio stations replayed Rush tracks non-stop for a week. It wasn't just a concert anymore, it was a movement. And yet, as the echo of that night began to fade, something else stirred beneath the celebration. Questions. Rumors. Because as monumental as that show was, there was something more coming. Something no one, not even the band, could have predicted. But what happened after that performance sent shockwaves across the world. The morning after the show, the world woke up to a different kind of noise, not the blare of headlines or gossip, but the hum of something reborn. Every platform, every feed, every radio station carried the same pulse: Rush had returned. Clips from the night before dominated social media. A single frame, Geddy Lee whispering, "For Neil," before setting down his mic, became an instant symbol, shared millions of times. Hashtags flooded the internet, hashtag Rush Lives, hashtag For Neil, hashtag The Return of Real. On TikTok, teenagers who had never touched a vinyl record were lip-syncing to Tom Sawyer. On Twitter, lifelong fans wrote threads about where they were the first time they heard 2112, and how they cried seeing Rush on stage again. Within 24 hours, Rush's old albums were back on the charts. Moving Pictures climbed into the top 10 on iTunes. Vinyl stores reported sellouts across the globe. Spotify saw a 700% spike in Rush streams overnight. For the first time in decades, pure musicianship was trending. But it wasn't just fans. It was everyone. Dave Grohl tweeted, "Legends don't age. They echo." Metallica posted a photo of their rehearsal room, captioned, "Learning from the Masters." Even Billie Eilish, a voice of a new generation, shared a clip of the Massey Hall performance, writing, "This is art." News anchors who had covered wars and elections opened their broadcasts with the same footage, that glowing stage, that single empty drum kit under the spotlight. CNN called it the most unifying cultural moment since Live Aid. The BBC simply titled their segment, "Rush Reminds the World Why Music Matters." Then came the flood of tributes. Street artists in London painted sprawling murals of Neil Peart with the caption, "The Professor Never Dies." In Buenos Aires, fans gathered in city squares to play Rush songs live, hundreds of guitars ringing together. In Tokyo, an orchestra performed an instrumental tribute, blending classical strings with electric riffs. What had begun as a surprise show was turning into a global celebration of authenticity, a rebellion against disposable culture. People weren't just cheering for a band, they were defending the idea of art itself. In Los Angeles, a group of young musicians released a statement that went viral: "We grew up believing music was about algorithms. Last night, Rush reminded us it's about soul." The response snowballed. Documentaries were announced within a week. Streaming platforms scrambled to license old concert footage. Netflix confirmed a special titled "Time Stands Still," the night Rush returned. Fan forums that had gone quiet for years suddenly surged with life, thousands of new members joining daily. One comment captured the mood perfectly. "It's like the universe gave rock one last breath, and it sounded like Rush." In Toronto, candlelight vigils appeared outside the band's old recording studio. People left flowers, drumsticks, and handwritten notes. Someone placed a sign reading, "You didn't just play music. You played memory." But the magic wasn't confined to nostalgia. Young creators, digital artists, producers, even EDM DJs, began remixing Rush's classics. They didn't distort them, they honored them. The line between generations blurred. The music industry, long obsessed with virality, suddenly remembered longevity. For Geddy Lee and Alex Lifeson, watching it unfold was surreal. From their quiet homes, they scrolled through the endless cascade of videos and headlines. Geddy chuckled softly at one fan comment that read, "They didn't just age gracefully, they aged mythically." But for all the noise, something subtler was happening underneath. A shift in how people felt, not just about Rush, but about creativity itself. In classrooms, teachers used Rush lyrics to talk about perseverance. In therapy sessions, fans described how hearing the garden again helped them process loss. Parents introduced their children to the band, not as a relic, but as a legacy. It became more than music. It became identity. And somewhere, beyond all the applause and hashtags, something even deeper took root, a quiet, collective realization that mastery never fades, and sincerity never goes out of style. Because what Rush gave the world that night wasn't a reunion, it was a reminder. That art created with truth can outlast time, trends, and even tragedy. The comeback wasn't about proving anything. It was about remembering everything. And as the noise of celebration continued to echo across continents, one truth became clear: this wasn't just a moment for Rush. It was a moment for everyone who had ever believed in the power of doing something real. But just when the world thought the story had reached its perfect ending, something new began to stir in the shadows of their triumph. Because beyond fame and applause, something deeper was born. In the quiet that followed the frenzy, when the cameras had packed up and the lights dimmed, Geddy and Alex sat alone in the dressing room. The cheers had faded, the viral clips had slowed, and yet the weight of what they had done lingered like a melody that refuses to end. It wasn't just a concert, a chart-topping moment, or a viral sensation. It was a statement. This, Geddy said softly, almost to himself, was never about fame. Alex nodded, eyes tracing the familiar scratches on the studio walls, marks left by decades of creation, frustration, and triumph. It was about faith, he replied. Faith in the music, in each other, in something bigger than ourselves. And that faith was the true hero of the story. Not the lights, not the applause, not the millions of social media reactions, though all of those were extraordinary. Faith in craft. Faith in friendship. Faith in the idea that art, when made honestly, can outlive mortality. Rush had always been more than a band. They were a philosophy, that excellence mattered, that intellect could meet emotion, that mastery was a pursuit worth living for. Their return was a reaffirmation of that belief, a reminder that creation doesn't die when its creators are gone, it persists, shapes, and inspires. Across the globe, artists of every stripe began to understand something fundamental. It isn't the size of the stage or the glow of the spotlight that defines legacy. It's the courage to continue, the refusal to settle for easy applause, the willingness to honor the past while stepping boldly into the future. Geddy reflected on their journey. The early tours, the relentless studio sessions, the heartbreak of losing Neil, it had all led to this moment. Not as an endpoint, but as a bridge. Every note they had ever played, every lyric written in a storm of doubt and hope, had converged into a singular truth: music, like life, is eternal only when it is lived with integrity. Alex added, and it's not just about surviving. It's about resonating. Every person who felt something last night, that's the echo. That's the proof. The echo was everywhere. Students picking up guitars inspired by their videos. Fans introducing Rush to children who had never experienced the raw power of live music. Journalists writing not only about the band, but about the ideals they represented: dedication, intelligence, resilience. In a way, Rush's return had become a metaphor. For every creator silenced by fear, for every dream deferred by doubt, there was a lesson embedded in those chords and drumbeats: it is never too late to honor what you love. Excellence and authenticity will always find an audience, even if the world has moved on. This isn't nostalgia, Geddy whispered. It's a continuation. A reminder that what we create can outlive the moment. That love, effort, and truth, they echo. Alex smiled. And maybe that's the real gift. Not the concert, not the headlines, not even the records. But the idea that someone, somewhere, will hear our work and find courage for their own. They looked at each other, understanding silently what no press release or viral clip could convey. This was larger than themselves. Larger than the band. Larger even than the man who had given them rhythm, poetry, and life itself. This was about the enduring power of craft and the human spirit. It was about faith in the intangible, the belief that something made with heart, patience, and devotion can ripple across time, touching lives it could never have imagined. Rush's music had become a beacon, a proof that perseverance and authenticity matter, even in a world obsessed with instant gratification. As the final note of their last performance still vibrated in memory, they realized something profound: legacy isn't a monument built overnight. It's a series of choices, small and large, that honor what came before while daring to step into the unknown. And in that quiet, one truth emerged with absolute clarity: legends don't fade. They echo. Through every riff, every lyric, every inspired fan who carries the sound forward, the essence of Rush would persist, not as a relic, not as nostalgia, but as living, breathing art. Because in the end, this story wasn't about a band returning to the stage. It was about courage, faith, and the eternal resonance of doing something meaningful. And that is a lesson every artist, every dreamer, every human being can carry forward. Cliffhanger: because legends don't fade, they echo. The lights have dimmed, the crowds have gone home, and yet the resonance of that night lingers in every corner of the world. The legendary Canadian band didn't just return to the road, they reminded the world what real music sounds like: raw, honest, and unyielding. They showed that mastery isn't measured in fame or fleeting trends, but in devotion, passion, and the courage to continue when the world assumes the story is over. Geddy Lee, Alex's lifeson, and the memory of Neil Peart taught us something that no viral sensation could ever convey: art is timeless when it is created with heart, and legacy lives in every soul it touches. From the roar of the arenas to the quiet moments in bedrooms where fans strummed those iconic riffs for the first time, Rush's return became more than a performance. It became a movement, a reaffirmation that authenticity still matters, that dedication still resonates, and that courage can inspire millions. And now, it's up to us to carry that spirit forward. To honor what is real, to celebrate mastery, and to never settle for mediocrity. Let their journey remind us that the power of creation isn't just in the music we hear, it's in the passion we put into our own lives. Because when authenticity speaks, the world listens. Subscribe, share, and be part of this movement. Keep the spirit of real art alive. Celebrate those who create not for applause, but for meaning. Pass it on. Let the echo of dedication, courage, and integrity ripple across the next generation. The stage may empty, but the music, the real music, never dies.